Chapter 6: The Friction of the Grind. The manifestation of the Empress had shattered whatever illusions the players had about this world being a typical low-stakes survival game. Her presence had left an indelible mark on the server, a lingering psychic weight that made the vast subterranean cavern of the fortress feel less like a starting zone and more like the womb of a rising superpower. But when the blinding light of her arrival finally faded, the thousands of incoming Wave 2 players were left standing shoulder to shoulder in a dark, sprawling iron scrapyard, staring at a UI interface that demanded a staggering amount of collective labor just to survive, let alone progress. The planet Tartarsevi didn't care about their grand ambitions or their newly multiplied numbers. The hypercitic rain continued to pound against the valley's crude iron shielding, leaking through unsealed vents and leaving a chalky, corrosive yellow crust on everything it touched. The thick sulfur fog rolled off the tectonic ridges, carrying the heavy scent of burnt copper and rotten eggs. This was the immediate friction of the world, an environment that actively fought their machinery, rusted their joints, and punished uncoordinated groups. Every hour spent out in the open flats was an hour spent accumulating invisible degradation ticks on their equipment counters, a slow mechanical decay that could only be stopped by proper shelter and constant maintenance. To unlock the blueprints for actual dedicated infrastructure like the command center or the Tier 1 enforcer mechs, the server had to collectively drag the settlement from its current, broken state up to base level 5. Right now, the base was stuck at a primitive level 2, meaning they lacked the specialized facilities to automate or coordinate anything. The requirements to level up were daunting: 150,000 units of refined materials, and a population of 2,500 rescued non-player characters to act as the base's backbone. The 500 original veterans, the self-proclaimed Alpha Vanguard, suddenly found themselves thrust into leadership roles, trying to organize thousands of chaotic rookies who were still learning how to balance the hyper-realistic weight distribution of their clanking, unarmored rig-class industrial loaders. "Keep those columns tight," Trashcan's voice boomed over the localized logistics channel, thick with the static of the planet's dense ambient radiation fields. "We have 300 new loaders rolling out to the eastern flats for Project 1. If your tractor treads start slipping in the volcanic silt, do not overrev your engine. You will snap your drive shaft, and the mechanics inside the makeshift repair tents are already backed up for 3 hours flat. If you get stuck, call for a heavy puller. Don't try to be a hero and ruin your transmission." The settlement was a teeming, industrialized anthill, but it was completely devoid of high-tech interfaces. Without a command center, there was no central tactical map or automated deployment screen. Instead, the headquarters was nothing more than a drafty, structural scrap tent pitched in the center of the cavern. Inside, faction leaders stood around a battered metal table, tracking the positions of scavenging squads by manually pinning paper maps to a sheet of rusted iron. Information wasn't delivered via automated pings. It was relayed by scouts running back from the surface on foot or shouting over short-range radios that constantly clipped out due to the atmospheric sulfur. Every single logistics route, material drop, and security detail had to be calculated and coordinated by hand using local server text chats and makeshift spreadsheets. Outside the command tent, hundreds of top-heavy loud walking roll cages were fanning out into the toxic fog. Moving the massive plasteel girders required to erect the first iron mega-warehouses wasn't a matter of clicking an item in an inventory screen. It required 3 or 4 players coordinating their pneumatic gripping claws in perfect synchronization, their engines whining in deep, guttural protest as the physics engine simulated the shifting momentum of the 3-ton metal beams. Every step forward in the mud required deliberate throttle management. If the construction crews didn't weld the structural load-bearing pillars correctly, the toxic downpour would cause the entire warehouse roof to collapse, ruining hours of work and degrading the server's material storage cap. The players weren't just playing a game, they were experiencing an exercise in wartime logistics. The grind was intentionally slow, designed to make every single scrap of progress feel like an earned victory. Because they lacked a true engineering bay, there were no precision fabrication tools. Players couldn't forge new parts from scratch. If a loader pilot wanted to modify their machine, they had to do it the dirty way, manually dragging a piece of salvaged Imperial armor over to a manual plasma torch, cutting it down to size, and physically welding it onto their exposed roll cage. The modification system at this stage was a chaotic test of structural intuition. Every addition changed the machine's center of mass, its fuel consumption rate, and its vulnerability to the harsh weather. If an enforcer pilot wanted to mount a heavy smoking Imperial machine gun onto their shoulder hardpoint, they had to balance the extra weight by stripping away defensive plating from the rear hull or risk having their loader tip over every time they took a sharp turn in the volcanic mud. If a player wanted to overclock their low-emission thrusters for longer bursts of speed, they had to jury-rig custom cooling lines out of salvaged radiator coils to prevent the engine from melting through the cockpit during a fight. Every single nut, bolt, and weld had a mechanical cost. The players spent hours in the mud outside the repair tents, exchanging blueprints over the local server network, testing structural load tolerances, and treating their worn-out corporate security surplus gear like hot rods. They were converting agricultural and industrial trash into specialized instruments of guerrilla warfare. The chat rooms were filled with mathematical breakdowns of torque-to-weight ratios and debate over whether it was better to run thicker structural frames or lighter, faster engines that could outrun the acid clouds. "Look at this layout," Copperhead muttered, his avatar standing on a wooden scaffold beside his loader, wiping black grease from his visor. He had stripped the heavy roll cage entirely, replacing it with overlapping slabs of rusted plasteel armor taken from a defeated PDF transport. On the right arm, instead of a standard cargo claw, he had spent 2 hours manually welding a high-frequency industrial plasma blade, jury-rigged to draw power directly from the main engine core. "The power draw is right on the red line, and my hydraulic fluid is leaking from the pressure. But if I catch a PDF scout unit from behind in the fog, this blade will melt through their chassis before they can even turn their turrets." "It's a glass cannon build," Goblin remarked, leaning against a stack of unrefined iron ingots while adjusting the manual sights on his long rifle. "If they hit your power core, the feedback loop will detonate your entire cockpit because we don't have the shielding templates yet. But out there in the sulfur haze, speed and raw damage are the only things that actually keep you alive anyway. I've stripped my plating down to the bare skeleton, just so I can hit 40 miles an hour when the scouting alerts go live." The collective focus shifted from isolated survival to cooperative industrial efficiency. Thousands of players realized that the game required an intricate division of labor. The salvagers could not bring back the raw metal without the logistics players maintaining the manual fuel pumps, and the mechanics could not patch the custom weapons without the soldiers keeping the perimeter secure. The entire economy was tightly bound to the physical reality of the base. If a warehouse ran out of space, the surplus metal left outside would simply dissolve in the acid rain within 48 hours, turning into worthless orange sludge. This mechanical threat forced the community into a state of hyperorganization, creating manual shift rotations for construction and hauling squads that ran 24 hours a day. As the player base adjusted to the weight of this grueling cycle, a breathless scout player burst into the central scrap tent, his scout frame hissing as the acidic condensation evaporated off its hot exhaust vents. He didn't bring a digital file, he brought a verbal warning. The automated logistics network of Sector 7 had registered a prolonged silence from the mortar outpost we had dismantled days ago. The Imperial techlogicians still assumed the disruption was caused by the planet's violent tectonic shifts or a sudden toxic gas blowout, but standard operating procedure demanded confirmation. The scout had spotted movement at the edge of the dead zone. 3 heavy, multi-wheeled PDF armored transport vehicles had entered the sector. They weren't an invading army yet. They were a heavily armed investigative team, moving slowly through the sulfur fog to find out why their artillery outpost had gone dark. Inside the command tent, Trashcan leaned over the paper map, drawing a heavy black line across the ravine path with a grease pencil. There were no automated systems to deploy their allies for them. If they wanted to defend the valley, the veterans would have to manually run out to the subterranean dormitories, rouse the 300 rescued penal laborers and deserters by hand, and guide them to their positions in the scrap concrete bunkers. With their custom, jury-rigged modifications locked into their chassis and their manual trap triggers prepped along the ravine walls, the community prepared for the coming impact. The friction of the grind had forged them into something dangerous, transforming an unorganized mob of internet gamers into a tightly knit, industrialized enclave. They had built every single inch of this scrapyard with raw sweat, calculation, and salvaged iron, and they were finally ready to use their battered, rusted war machines to defend it. You have reached the end of the text.